Sometimes the greatest victories come wrapped in chains, and the most powerful rulers discover they've been defeated by those they underestimated. Love has a way of turning the hunter into the hunted, especially when ancient laws meet modern. Cunning. King Kael ruled his realm with one simple law: speak the forbidden tongue in his presence, and you belong to him forever. No one had ever dared challenge this until Lyra was captured and dragged before his throne. She knelt down and spoke the ancient words, but something went terribly wrong. The king's smile faded as he realized she had turned his own binding against him. What happens when the most powerful man in the kingdom discovers he's been outplayed by the woman he thought he'd conquered? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The great hall of Valdres Castle stretched before them like a canyon carved from stone and shadow. Torchlight flickered against walls that had witnessed 15 years of King Kael's absolute rule, casting dancing shadows that seemed to whisper of old laws and older secrets. The massive iron crown upon his brow caught the firelight, each embedded stone a trophy from a conquered realm, a reminder of his unquestioned dominance over the known world. Kael Drakemore had built this kingdom from the ashes of 7 fallen realms, his sword cutting through resistance like morning mist. At 35, he possessed the kind of presence that made lesser men step aside and women lower their eyes, not from shame, but from an instinctive recognition of predatory power. His frame filled the throne carved from black granite, every inch of him speaking to decades of warfare and the weight of absolute authority. The scars that traced his arms told stories of battles won, of enemies who had underestimated the young warrior prince who had united these fractured lands under one unbreakable rule. But tonight, something had shifted in the carefully ordered world of Valdres. The court buzzed with nervous energy, nobles whispering behind jeweled fans and goblets of wine. Lord Aldrich, his most trusted advisor, paced near the throne with the measured steps of a man trying to maintain composure in an impossible situation. The ancient binding law had been invoked countless times over the decades, always as Kael intended, always resulting in another Omega bound to his will. The law was simple, absolute, and had never failed. Speak the old tongue in the presence of the Alpha King, and your fate was sealed until tonight. Lyra knelt in chains before the throne, her dark hair falling like a curtain across her face, but even bound and captured, she radiated a defiance that seemed to fill the vast space around them. She was not what the court expected from a captured spy. Where others cowered, she remained steady. Where others begged, she waited with the patience of someone holding cards no one else could see. "Your Majesty," Lord Aldrich ventured, his voice carefully controlled. "The binding has never behaved in this manner. Perhaps we should consult the ancient texts." "The texts are clear," Kael interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, even as doubt crept through his thoughts. Like cold water through stone. When an Omega speaks the forbidden words, they are bound. The law does not bend. Yet even as he spoke these words, Kael felt the strange pull that had begun the moment Lyra's voice had filled the hall with sounds he had not heard in decades. The old tongue, the language of his ancestors, the words that had built this very kingdom. She had spoken them with perfect pronunciation, with an authority that suggested years of study, and with a tone that had turned his moment of triumph into something else entirely. Lyra raised her head, meeting his gaze with eyes the color of storm clouds. "The law does not bend, Your Majesty, but it can be turned." The court fell silent. In 15 years of rule, no one had dared speak to the king with such casual insolence. Yet Lyra's words carried no disrespect, only a certainty that matched his own. She spoke like someone stating a simple fact, like mentioning the weather or the time of day. "You know nothing of the law," Kael growled, but the words felt hollow even as they left his lips. I know that every law written by hand can be read. By hand, Lyra replied, her voice carrying across the hall with crystalline clarity. I know that your ancestors were wiser than you imagine, and more careful with their words than you have been with yours. Lord Aldrich stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively to his sword. Your Majesty, this insolence cannot. What? Lyra asked, turning her attention to the advisor with the same unnerving calm she had shown the king. Cannot be allowed? Cannot be tolerated, or cannot be answered. Kael raised his hand, stopping Aldrich's advance. There was something in Lyra's manner, something in the way she held herself despite the chains, that demanded attention rather than punishment. She had spent months infiltrating his kingdom, had gathered intelligence on his defenses, his routines, his weaknesses. She had come here to kill him, of that much he was certain. Yet now, bound by ancient law to remain in his presence, she seemed less like a failed assassin and more like a puzzle he could not solve. Tell me your true name, Kael commanded, his voice carrying the full weight of royal authority. I am Lyra of the Western Reach, she replied without hesitation. Daughter of merchants, student of languages, and apparently your most unexpected problem. The pendant at her throat caught the torchlight as she spoke. Piece of silver so old, it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The design was intricate, clearly ancient, and entirely unfamiliar to everyone present except Lyra herself. She wore it like a talisman, like a shield made of memory and purpose. The Western Reach fell to my armies 12 years ago, Kael said slowly. There are no merchants left in those lands. No, Lyra agreed. There are not. The simple acknowledgement carried more weight than any plea or accusation might have. In those 3 words, Kael heard the echo of burning villages and displaced families, of a conquest that had seemed righteous at the time and now felt like a stone in his chest. Lord Aldrich cleared his throat. Your Majesty, the eastern borders require your attention. The reports can wait. Kael's eyes never left Lyra's face. The binding prevents me from traveling far from the castle grounds. You know this as well as I do. The binding. Lady Marin spoke from her place among the court. Her voice, sharp with years of political maneuvering, was meant to ensure loyalty, not create weakness. Perhaps it would be simpler to what? Lyra interrupted, her tone carrying a hint of dark amusement. Kill me? Do you think death releases a binding freely given? Do you imagine the ancient laws are so easily broken? The court exchanged glances filled with growing unease. The binding law had always been a tool of control, a way to ensure absolute loyalty from those who might otherwise resist. But Lyra had turned it into something else entirely, had made it into a chain that bound the king as surely as it bound her. You planned this, Kael realized, his voice low and dangerous. This was never about assassination. This was about the binding. Lyra's smile was as sharp as winter frost. Your Majesty is beginning to understand. Understand what? That conquest without wisdom is merely destruction. That power without knowledge is simply brutality. That the daughter of merchants might have learned things that the son of warriors never thought to study. The silver pendant at her throat seemed to pulse with its own inner light, and for a moment, the great hall felt larger and older than it had any right to be. The stones themselves seemed to remember voices that had spoken these same words in centuries past, laws that had been written not to create servants, but to create balance. You know more about the old laws than you have revealed, Kael stated, no longer asking. I know that knowledge is the only weapon that cannot be taken by force, Lyra replied. I know that your ancestors built safeguards into their laws that you have forgotten. And I know that the binding you thought would make me your property has made you mine instead. The court erupted in whispers, but Kael heard none of them. He was looking at Lyra with new eyes, seeing not just the captured spy or the defiant Omega, but the careful architect of a plan that had been years in the making. She had not stumbled into this situation. She had crafted it with the precision of a master strategist and the patience of someone seeking not just revenge, but justice. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What I want, Your Majesty, and what I intend to have are two very different things," Lyra replied. "But both begin with truth, and truth, as you are about to discover, is a more binding law than any your ancestors ever wrote." The revelation of Lyra's knowledge struck the court like lightning strikes a tree sudden, illuminating and permanently transformative. In the hours that followed, as the great hall slowly emptied of nervous nobles and whispering courtiers, the true weight of the situation began to settle upon the kingdom like morning fog over battlefields. Kael remained on his throne long. After protocol demanded he retire, his powerful frame somehow diminished by the understanding that his authority had been challenged not through force, but through wisdom he did not possess. The crown upon his head felt heavier than it ever had, each embedded stone now seeming to whisper questions instead of declaring victories. "Explain the binding," he commanded, his voice echoing in the nearly empty hall. Lyra had been given a chair. Small mercy that Lord Aldrich had reluctantly granted after realizing that their situation required negotiation rather than intimidation. She sat with the poise of nobility, despite the chains that still bound her wrists, despite the circumstances that should have left her broken and pleading. "The binding you invoke so casually has three forms," she began, her voice carrying the cadence of someone who had studied these laws not as curiosities, but as weapons. "The first is submission. The Omega speaks the words and accepts the Alpha's dominance completely. This is the binding you have used countless times." Kael nodded grimly. This much he knew. "The second is reversal. The Omega speaks the words, but invokes the ancient right of challenge, binding the Alpha to them instead. This is what I have done." "Impossible," Lord Aldrich interrupted from his position near the throne. "Such a law would make the binding meaningless. No Alpha would risk such a reversal." Lyra's smile held no warmth. "Your ancestors were wiser than you assume. They understood that true power must be earned, not simply claimed. The reversal binding exists to prevent tyrants from abusing the law, to ensure that only those worthy of dominance could maintain it." "And the third form?" Kael asked, though he was beginning to suspect he did not want to know. "Death binding. If the Omega speaks the words while dying, both souls are bound beyond life itself, ensuring that the Alpha joins them in whatever comes after." Lyra's eyes met his steadily. "I trust the particular option will not be necessary." The implications crashed over Kael like waves over a drowning man. Every time he had invoked the binding law, he had risked not just failure, but complete reversal of his power. Every Omega who had knelt before him could have destroyed him with the same words that had made them his property. Why did the others never attempt reversal? He asked. "Because they did not know it existed," Lyra replied simply. The knowledge of the reversal clause was carefully guarded, passed down through bloodlines that understood the true purpose of the law. Your conquests scattered those bloodlines, destroyed the libraries, killed the keepers of such wisdom. You created a world where the binding could only work in your favor because you eliminated everyone who knew otherwise. The weight of this truth settled upon him like armor made of lead. How many had died carrying knowledge that could have freed them? How many have submitted not because they were weak, but because they had been denied the very information that could have saved them? "You studied these laws specifically to trap me," Kael realized. "I studied them to understand my enemy," Lyra corrected. "The trap was simply the most elegant solution to an otherwise impossible problem." Lord Aldrich stepped forward, his weathered face grave with concern. "Your Majesty, regardless of the binding's nature, the eastern borders still require attention." Our scouts report movement from 3 separate armies, and without your presence to coordinate the defense, without my presence, they will overrun our outer settlements within a fortnight," Kael finished bitterly. "Yes, Aldrich, I understand the situation perfectly. But understanding and resolving were entirely different things. The binding that now held him would not permit him to travel beyond the castle grounds for more than brief periods. To mount an effective defense of the eastern borders would require weeks of campaign, constant movement between strategic positions, and personal leadership of forces spread across hundreds of miles of territory. "The binding has limitations," Lyra said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "Distance, time, circumstances. It is not meant to be a prison, merely a tether." "How long?" Kael demanded. "How long can you be away from me? Or how long will the binding last?" "Both." Lyra considered this carefully, her fingers absently touching the silver pendant at her throat. The ancient metal seemed to whisper secrets as she moved it between her fingers, catching torchlight and throwing it back in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "The distance limitation is approximately 3 leagues. Beyond that, you would begin to feel compulsion to return, growing stronger with each mile. The time limitation depends on the distance hours at the farthest reaches, days within the immediate area, and duration until one of us dies or until the binding is willingly dissolved by both parties." The finality of it struck him like a physical blow. This was not a temporary inconvenience or a political complication to be maneuvered around. This was a fundamental alteration of his existence, a redefinition of power that placed him at the mercy of someone whose true intentions remained hidden beneath layers of careful planning and ancient knowledge. "What do you truly want from me?" Kael asked, abandoning the formal protocols that had governed every interaction of his adult life. Lyra was quiet for so long that he began to wonder if she would answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight of emotion that had been absent from all their previous exchanges. "I want you to understand what you have done," she said softly. "I want you to feel what it means to have your choices taken away, to have your freedom dependent on the mercy of someone who has every reason to hate you. I want you to know what it feels like to be bound." The honest pain in her voice cut through his anger like a blade through silk. This was not the calculated cruelty of a political enemy or the cold satisfaction of a successful spy. This was something far more personal, far more dangerous. "And after I understand?" he asked. "After you understand, we will discuss what comes next." Lord Aldrich cleared his throat diplomatically. "Your Majesty, the immediate concern is the defense of the eastern borders. Perhaps Lady Lyra could accompany." "I am not a lady," Lyra interrupted sharply. "I am what your king made me, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to gain from his downfall." But even as she spoke these words, something in her expression suggested that the truth was more complicated than her anger would indicate. The pendant at her throat caught the light again, and for just a moment, Kael thought he saw something familiar in its ancient design, something that stirred memories he could not quite reach. "That pendant," he said slowly. "I've seen its like before." Lyra's hand moved protectively to cover the silver piece, but not before he caught another glimpse of the intricate patterns carved into its surface. Symbols that spoke of noble houses and royal bloodlines, of family crests that had once held power in lands that no longer existed. "Where?" she asked, and for the first time since her capture, her voice carried genuine concern. But Kael could not answer, could not place the memory that danced just beyond his reach like smoke in wind. He knew only that the pendant was important, that its presence here was not coincidence, and that the woman who wore it carried secrets that went deeper than espionage or revenge. The binding that held them together was only the beginning. Dawn broke over Valdris Castle like a reluctant witness to the previous night's upheaval. In the pale morning light, the great hall looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of ancient laws and binding magic had compressed the very stones into a more intimate space. Kael had not slept, had not even attempted to rest, and that exhaustion showed in the hard lines around his eyes and the tension that held his powerful frame rigid against his throne. Lord Aldrich entered with a collection of leather-bound volumes that had clearly seen better centuries, their pages yellow with age and their bindings cracked from decades of careful storage in the deepest vaults of the castle's library. Behind him came Master Alduin, the castle scholar, a thin man whose lifetime of study had left him bent like a question mark over ancient texts. "Your Majesty," Master Alduin began, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who had survived multiple regime changes by avoiding political opinions. "We have located several references to the binding laws in the oldest archives. The news is both enlightening and concerning." Kael gestured for him to continue, though his attention remained partially focused on Lyra, who sat in her chair with the patience of someone who had expected this exact scenario. She'd have been provided with water and simple food, courtesies that reflected the uncomfortable reality that she was simultaneously prisoner and captor, enemy and necessity. "The reversal binding is indeed authentic," Master Alduin continued, opening one of the ancient texts with the reverence due to irreplaceable artifacts. "However, the methods for dissolving such a binding are limited and specific. Mutual consent, as the lady mentioned, or the death of one party. There are also references to what appears to be a ritual of transfer, but the relevant pages have been damaged beyond readability." "Show me," Kael commanded. The scholar approached with careful steps, holding the book open to display pages where elegant script had been interrupted by brown stains and missing sections. What remained was tantalizingly incomplete fragments of instructions that might have offered solutions had they survived the centuries intact. "The damage appears to be deliberate," Master Alduin noted quietly. "These pages were not lost to time or neglect. Someone removed the information intentionally." Lyra spoke for the first time since dawn. "Your predecessors were thorough in their efforts to ensure the binding could never be turned against them. They preserved the submission clause and destroyed the rest. You seem remarkably well informed about the actions of kings who died before your birth," Lord Aldrich observed, his tone carrying suspicious undertones. "Knowledge has a way of surviving destruction when it is important enough," Lyra replied, "especially when it is preserved by those who understand its true value." Kael closed the ancient text with more force than necessary. The sound echoed through the hall like a judgment being rendered. "Enough riddles. If you possess knowledge that can resolve this situation, speak plainly." "The binding cannot be broken by force or trickery," Lyra said, meeting his gaze directly. "It can only be dissolved. Through understanding, both parties must comprehend not just the nature of their bond, but the reasons it was created." "The reasons? Why do you think your ancestors created such a law, Your Majesty? What purpose did it serve beyond providing you with compliant subjects?" The question struck him as unexpectedly complex. He had never questioned the binding law's origins, had simply accepted it as part of his inherited authority, like the crown or the throne or the loyalty of his armies. But Lyra's challenge forced him to consider possibilities he had never examined. "Control," he answered finally. "Unity. The prevention of rebellion among those who might otherwise challenge royal authority." Lyra shook her head slowly. "Your ancestors were not tyrants, despite what your rule might suggest. They were builders, creating laws that would preserve their kingdom through crisis and change. The binding was never meant to create slaves. It was meant to create understanding between rulers and subjects, to forge connections that would endure when political alliances failed." "Understanding," Kael repeated, tasting the word like something foreign. "When an alpha and omega are bound, they share more than proximity. They share insight, perspective, even in some small way, experience. The submission binding teaches the Omega to see through the Alpha's eyes, to understand the weight of leadership. The reversal binding does the opposite. The implications of this settled over him gradually, like cold water seeping through stone. If Lyra spoke truth, then the binding that held them was not simply a mystical chain, but a forced intimacy that would eventually allow each to understand the other's motivations, fears, and desires. "You mean for me to see the world as you do," he realized. "I mean for you to understand what your conquests cost the conquered." Lord Aldrich stepped forward, his weathered face creased with concern. "Your Majesty, the eastern borders cannot wait for philosophical revelations. The enemy forces grow stronger with each passing day, and our own troops require leadership. Our own troops require a king who can lead them effectively," Kael interrupted sharply. "A king who can travel freely, who can coordinate strategy across vast distances, who can inspire confidence rather than uncertainty." "Then perhaps," Lyra said quietly, "we should discuss the possibility of cooperation." The word hung in the air like an unexploded arrow. Cooperation implied partnership, mutual benefit, shared objectives. It implied treating Lyra not as a prisoner, or a problem to be solved, but as an equal whose knowledge and abilities might serve the kingdom's needs. "What form would such cooperation take?" Kael asked carefully. "I know things about your enemies that your scouts have not discovered. I understand their strategies, their weaknesses, their ultimate objectives. This knowledge was part of my original mission, to gather intelligence that would help coordinate the attack on your kingdom. And you would share this intelligence with the man you came to kill?" Lyra's smile held no warmth, but it did carry a kind of grim honesty. "I would share it with the man who now faces the same threats I was meant to help create. Survival, Your Majesty, creates strange alliances." "Lord!" Aldrich looked skeptical. "What guarantee would we have of her truthfulness? What prevents her from feeding us false information that would lead our forces into disaster?" "The binding," Lyra replied simply. "If Kael dies, I face the consequences of our connection. If the kingdom falls, I fall with it. My survival now depends on his success, not his failure." The truth of this struck Kael with uncomfortable clarity. The binding had not just made him vulnerable. It had transformed his greatest enemy into someone whose interests were now aligned with his own, at least in terms of basic survival. "The eastern borders," he said slowly, testing the idea. "What? Do you know of the forces gathering there?" "I know that they are not three separate armies, but three wings of a single coordinated attack. I know that their true target is not your outer settlements, but the trade routes that supply this castle. And I know that they expect to face a king who fights as he always has alone, decisive, and ultimately predictable." For the first time since the binding, Kael felt a spark of something that might have been hope. The war room of Valdris Castle had not seen such tense deliberation since the unification campaigns 15 years prior. Maps covered the Great Oak, table-like territorial skin marked with colored pins and charcoal lines that traced enemy movements and supply routes. Kael stood at the table's head, his commanding presence somehow altered by Lyra's proximity, less solitary, more collaborative. Though he would not have admitted such a change to anyone present, Lyra had been given freedom to move throughout the castle grounds, a necessity born of the binding's requirements rather than trust. She stood beside the war table with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to strategic planning, her input proving invaluable despite the circumstances that had brought her here. "The attack will come in 3 phases, she explained, pointing to positions on the eastern map. "The first wave here at Millhaven, designed to draw your primary forces eastward. The second wave will strike the northern supply depot while your attention is focused on the initial battle. The third wave, the true attack, will move against the undefended trade routes while your forces are committed elsewhere. General Marcus, Kael's most experienced military commander, studied the map with practiced eyes. How can you be certain of their strategy? Because I helped design it, Lyra replied without hesitation. My mission was not simply assassination. It was intelligence gathering for a coordinated campaign meant to cripple your kingdom's economy while destroying your military effectiveness. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Here was confirmation that the woman bound to their king had indeed come as part of a larger conspiracy, had indeed planned his death as part of a strategy that would have left the kingdom vulnerable to complete conquest. Yet now you advise us how to counter it, General Marcus observed, his tone carefully neutral. Now my survival depends on the kingdom's survival, Lyra acknowledged. The binding ensures that my interests have shifted, regardless of my personal feelings about the situation. Lord Aldrich leaned forward, his weathered fingers tracing the marked routes on the map. If their strategy is as you describe, our conventional response would be to reinforce Millhaven and prepare for siege warfare. You suggest this would be exactly what they expect. Your king has a reputation for direct confrontation and overwhelming force, Lyra said, glancing at Kael. This strategy assumes he will respond to provocation with decisive action, committing his forces to protect what appears to be under immediate threat. And your alternative? Allow Millhaven to fall. The words struck the assembled commanders like a physical blow. Millhaven was home to nearly 3,000 people, a prosperous trading town that served as a crucial link in the kingdom's economic network. The idea of abandoning it to enemy forces went against every instinct of military leadership and royal responsibility. Absolutely not, General Marcus stated firmly. We do not sacrifice our own people for tactical advantage. Lyra's expression remained calm, though Kael thought he detected a flicker of something approval in her eyes. I did not say abandon the people. I said allow the town to fall. There is a difference. She moved to another section of the map, her finger tracing a route that wound through forest paths and hidden valleys. Evacuate the civilian population before the attack. Make it appear that they fled in panic at the first sign of enemy approach. Let the attacking force occupy an empty town while you position your real strength here, where they do not expect resistance. The strategy was audacious, requiring precise timing and coordination between military units and civilian evacuation. It also required a level of trust in intelligence provided by someone who had, until very recently, been their enemy. The risk is considerable, Lord Aldrich noted. If your intelligence proves incorrect, if my intelligence proves incorrect, we all face the consequences, Lyra interrupted. The binding ensures that I cannot act against the kingdom's interests without acting against my own. Kael had been silent throughout the exchange, studying not just the maps and strategies, but the woman who had appended his world with her knowledge and her audacity. The binding that held them together was beginning to work as she had described. He could sense her emotions in subtle ways, could detect the underlying currents of her thoughts, even when her words remained carefully controlled. She was afraid. Not of him, not of the court, but of the possibility that the intelligence she provided might prove insufficient to save a kingdom she had once sought to destroy. The binding had indeed shifted her loyalties, but it had done something more complex. As well, it had made her care about the outcome in ways that went beyond simple survival. We proceed with the evacuation, Kael decided. But we also prepare contingency plans for direct engagement if the strategy fails. General Marcus nodded grimly. How long do we have? 3 days, possibly 4, Lyra replied. The coordination between the 3 forces requires specific timing. They will not attack until they are certain all elements are in position. Then we begin evacuations immediately. Kael turned to Lord Aldrich. Send riders to Millhaven with evacuation orders. Make it appear that we fear the town cannot be defended. Let that message reach enemy ears if possible." As the council dispersed to implement the complex strategy, Kael found himself alone with Lyra for the first time since the binding. The war room felt larger in their solitude. The maps and battle plans somehow more personal when viewed through the lens of their forced partnership. "You could have recommended a strategy that would fail," he observed. "One that would appear sound but lead to disaster. The binding would not prevent such deception if you believed it served your ultimate goals." Lyra considered this carefully. "The binding affects more than conscious choice, Your Majesty. It influences instinct, emotional response, even subconscious decisions. I find myself caring about the success of plans I once hoped would fail. And this troubles you?" "It terrifies me," she admitted with startling honesty. To discover that your deepest convictions can be altered by mystical compulsion is to question the nature of free will itself. The vulnerability in her voice surprised him. Throughout their interactions, she had maintained careful control, revealing information and emotions only when they served her purposes. But the binding was working both ways. He realized, just as it forced her to care about his success, it compelled him to care about her fears. "I feel it too," he said quietly. "The pull toward understanding, toward seeing the world through your perspective. It is not comfortable for someone accustomed to certainty." "Certainty is a luxury we can no longer afford," Lyra replied. "Not when our survival depends on cooperation. Neither of us would have chosen freely." Outside the war room windows, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the castle grounds. Soon they would know whether the strategy born of their unlikely alliance would preserve the kingdom or lead it to destruction. The binding that held them together ensured they would face that outcome as one. The evacuation of Millhaven proceeded with the desperate efficiency of people who understood that survival depended on speed and silence. Kael watched from the castle's highest tower as dust clouds marked the movement of civilians along forest paths that would lead them to safety in the northern settlements. Each family carried only what they could manage: clothing, food, treasures that could be borne by hand or cart. Behind them, they left homes that had sheltered generations, businesses built through decades of work, and a way of life that might never be recovered. Lyra stood beside him at the tower window, her presence both comfort and reminder of the impossible circumstances that had brought them to this point. The binding allowed him to sense her emotional state in ways that went beyond observation. He could feel her guilt like a physical weight, her regret at the role she had played in bringing destruction to innocent people. "This was not your intention," he said quietly, though he was not entirely certain how he knew this to be true. "My intention was your death and the fall of your kingdom," Lyra replied with characteristic honesty. "The suffering of your people was an acceptable consequence of achieving those goals. But now I am forced to see them as more than abstractions, more than necessary sacrifices for a greater cause. The binding makes me feel their fear, their loss, their displacement. It makes me care about people I was prepared to condemn." The pain in her voice was genuine, and Kael found himself moved by it in ways that surprised him. Throughout his reign, he had made countless decisions that affected the lives of thousands, had weighed strategic advantages against human costs, had accepted that leadership sometimes required sacrificing the few for the many. But he had always maintained emotional distance from such choices, had convinced himself that royal responsibility demanded such detachment. The binding was teaching him that detachment was neither possible nor desirable. "Your Majesty," Lord Aldrich's voice interrupted their contemplation as he climbed the tower stairs with news from the scouts. "The enemy forces have been sighted. They are moving exactly as Lady Lyra predicted, 3 separate columns coordinating their approach toward Millhaven." Kael turned from the window, his mind shifting from philosophical reflection to immediate tactical concerns. Our forces are in position? General Marcus reports readiness at all designated points. The main force is concealed in the Thornwood Valley. The cavalry units are positioned to cut off enemy retreat routes, and the archers are stationed along the ridgelines overlooking the planned ambush site. And Millhaven appears abandoned? Completely. A few buildings have been left with fires burning to suggest hasty evacuation, and we have scattered personal belongings along the evacuation routes to reinforce the impression of panicked flight. Lyra nodded approvingly. They will believe the population fled at the first sign of approaching armies. It fits their expectations of how civilians respond to military threats. How can you be certain they will not suspect deception? Lord Aldrich asked. Because they know Kael's reputation, Lyra replied, glancing at the king. He has never retreated from a direct challenge, never abandoned territory without overwhelming reason. They will assume the evacuation represents fear, not strategy. The assessment stung with its accuracy. Kael had indeed built his reputation on direct confrontation and overwhelming force, had earned the loyalty of his armies through personal courage and decisive action. To his enemies, the idea that he might employ deception or strategic withdrawal would seem impossible, not because he lacked the intelligence for such tactics, but because his pride had never allowed him to consider them. They underestimate you, Lyra continued, just as I did. They see the warrior king who conquered 7 realms through superior strength, and they assume that strength is your only weapon. Is it not? The question carried more weight than he intended. Here, in this tower room with maps spread before them and the fate of his kingdom hanging in the balance, Kael found himself genuinely uncertain about the nature of his own abilities. The binding had forced him to question assumptions he had held for decades, had made him see familiar truths from unfamiliar angles. Strength is a tool, Lyra replied thoughtfully. It can build or destroy, protect or threaten, unite or divide. The question is not whether you possess strength, but whether you possess the wisdom to use it well. Before Kael could respond, the sound of hoofbeats in the courtyard below drew their attention back to the window. A messenger had arrived, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding, his uniform bearing the colors of the Eastern Scouts. News from the field, Lord Aldrich observed, already moving toward the stairs. They descended together, the binding ensuring that Lyra accompanied them whether by choice or compulsion. In the great hall, the messenger knelt before the throne, his breathing still labored from his urgent journey. "Your Majesty," he gasped, "the enemy forces have reached Millhaven. They found the town as we left it empty, with signs of hasty evacuation. They are proceeding with their occupation exactly as predicted. All 3 columns? Yes, Your Majesty. The main force is securing the town itself, while the flanking units are moving to cut off what they believe are the evacuation routes. They show no signs of suspecting our true strategy." Kael felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The first phase of their plan was succeeding, but success in war was often more dangerous than failure. It bred confidence that could lead to carelessness, assumptions that could prove fatal when circumstances changed. "What of our own forces?" he asked. "General Marcus reports that all units are in position and awaiting your signal. The enemy will be within our ambush zone by tomorrow morning if they maintain their current pace." Lyra stepped forward, her expression troubled. "Your Majesty, there is something else you should know about their strategy. The occupation of Millhaven is not their ultimate objective, it is bait." The words struck the assembled council like a physical blow. If Millhaven was bait, then their carefully planned ambush might be walking directly into a trap of their own. "Explain," Kael commanded. "They expect you to attempt to retake the town," Lyra said, moving to the war table where the map still displayed. "Their planned positions. They know your reputation, your tendency to respond to provocation with immediate action. The occupation of Millhaven is designed to draw you into a battle on ground of their choosing, with forces positioned to surround and destroy your army. Lord Aldrich studied the maps with growing alarm. If this is true, then our ambush strategy may be exactly what they anticipated. We could be leading our forces into destruction. Not necessarily, Lyra replied, tracing new lines on the map with her finger. Their counter-strategy assumes you will attack immediately, driven by anger and the need to protect your territory. But if we wait, if we allow them to commit to their positions around Millhaven, we can turn their trap into ours. How? By attacking when and where they do not expect it. They have positioned forces to defend against an immediate assault on the town. They have not prepared for a coordinated attack on their supply lines and communications. The strategy she outlined was complex, requiring coordination between multiple units and precise timing to avoid disaster. It also required patience, allowing the enemy to believe their strategy was succeeding while preparing a response that would catch them completely off guard. The risk is enormous, General Marcus observed when he was summoned to review the revised plan. If we miscalculate the timing, we could lose everything. If we proceed with the original plan, we will lose everything, Lyra replied firmly. The enemy knows Kael too well. They have planned for his strengths and his weaknesses. Only by acting contrary to his established patterns can we achieve victory. Kael looked around the war room at the faces of his advisors and commanders. These were men who had followed him through 15 years of conquest and consolidation, who had learned to trust his judgment even when the odds seemed impossible. Now he was asking them to trust not just his judgment, but the counsel of a woman who had come to kill him. We proceed with the revised strategy, he decided. Send word. To General Marcus, we attack their supply lines at dawn, 2 days hence. We will let them believe they have trapped us while we prepare to trap them. As the council dispersed to implement the new plan, Kael remained with Lyra in the war room. The binding between them had grown stronger over the past days, allowing him to sense not just her emotions, but something deeper, her fundamental character, her values, her fears and hopes. You could have remained silent about their counter-strategy, he observed. You could have allowed me to walk into their trap. The binding would not have permitted such deception, she replied. But even without mystical compulsion, I find myself unable to desire your destruction as I once did. Why? Lyra was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently touching the silver pendant at her throat. Because you are not the monster I expected to find. The revelation struck Kael with unexpected force. Throughout their interactions, he had assumed that Lyra's cooperation stemmed solely from the magical compulsion of the binding, that her advice and insights were given reluctantly, driven by necessity rather than choice. To learn that her feelings toward him had genuinely shifted, that she saw him as something other than the tyrant she had come to destroy, created a complexity of emotion he was unprepared to handle. What did you expect to find? He asked quietly. Lyra moved to the great window that overlooked the castle's main courtyard, where soldiers prepared for the coming battle with the methodical efficiency of men who had faced death before and expected to face it again. Her reflection in the glass looked younger than her years, touched with a vulnerability that her careful composure usually concealed. I expected to find a man drunk on power, surrounded by sycophants and enemies, ruling through fear and brutality. Alone. I expected someone who saw his subjects as resources to be exploited, his enemies as obstacles to be crushed, his kingdom as a possession to be controlled, rather than a responsibility to be honored. And instead I found a man who carries the weight of every decision, who understands the cost of leadership in ways that go beyond personal ambition. I found someone who questions his own choices, who worries about the consequences of his actions, who would rather bear the burden of difficult decisions than delegate them to others. The assessment was both flattering and troubling. Kael had never thought of himself in such terms, had never examined his motivations with the kind of analytical distance that Lyra's words suggested. The binding was forcing him to see himself through her eyes, just as it was forcing her to see the world through his. "You speak as if leadership is a burden rather than a privilege," he observed. "Is it not both?" Lyra replied, turning from the window to face him directly. "You have power that most men can barely imagine, authority that spans kingdoms, wealth that could purchase armies. But you also have responsibility for every life in this realm, accountability for every policy and decision, and the knowledge that your failures will cost others their homes, their livelihoods, their lives." The truth of this settled over him like a familiar weight. Yes, he had power, but power came with obligations that never ended, pressures that never eased, and consequences that extended far beyond his own existence. Every day brought decisions that affected thousands of people, choices that required balancing competing needs and impossible trade-offs. The binding allows you to feel this weight, he realized. You experience the burden of leadership through our connection, and you experience the cost of conquest through mine, Lyra replied. You feel what it means to have your world destroyed, your family killed, your future stolen by someone else's ambition. The exchange was interrupted by the arrival of Master Aldwin, the castle scholar, carrying another of the ancient texts that had been retrieved from the deepest archives. His expression carried the mixture of excitement and apprehension that suggested significant discovery. "Your Majesty," he began carefully, "I have found additional references to the binding laws in texts that predate the founding of this kingdom. The information is significant, though I fear it complicates our understanding rather than simplifying it." Kael gestured for him to continue, though part of him dreaded what new revelations might emerge from the dusty pages of forgotten wisdom. "The binding laws were not created by your ancestors," Master Aldwin explained, opening the ancient book to display pages covered in script so old it seemed to glow with its own inner light. "They were inherited from an earlier civilization, a kingdom that fell centuries before the first stone of Valdres Castle was laid." Lyra stepped closer to examine the text, her expression shifting from curiosity to recognition to something approaching shock. The silver pendant at her throat seemed to respond to the ancient words, catching light in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "The kingdom of Ethros," she whispered. "These are the laws of Ethros. You recognize this text?" Master Aldwin asked, surprised. "My family preserved fragments of these laws for generations," Lyra replied, her voice carrying a weight of emotion that had been absent from all their previous discussions. "They were part of our heritage, our connection to the kingdom that existed before conquest and displacement scattered our people across the known world." Kael felt something cold settle in his chest as understanding began to dawn. "Your family was not from the Western Reach originally." "No," Lyra admitted, her hand moving protectively to cover the silver pendant. "We were refugees from Ethros, carrying what remained of our royal bloodline and our ancient knowledge into exile." The implications crashed over him like a collapsing wall. Lyra was not simply a spy or an assassin seeking revenge for recent conquest. She was the displaced heir to a kingdom that his ancestors had helped destroy, carrying laws and knowledge that predated his own family's claim to power by centuries. "The binding laws were your birthright," he said slowly, "and you have been using them to enslave the descendants of the people who created them." Lyra replied, though her tone carried more sadness than anger. "The irony is not lost on me." Master Aldwin cleared his throat diplomatically. "The text suggests that the original purpose of the binding laws was not to create submission, but to forge alliances between ruling houses. The alphas and omegas of Ethros used the binding to ensure understanding and cooperation between leaders who might otherwise have been enemies. Political marriage through mystical compulsion, Kael observed grimly. More than that, Lyra corrected, studying the ancient text with the intensity of someone reading words that had been carried in her family's memory for generations. The binding was meant to prevent the kind of wholesale conquest that ultimately destroyed Ethros. By forcing potential enemies to understand each other's perspectives, to share the emotional and psychological costs of conflict, the laws created incentives for peaceful resolution rather than military dominance. Yet Ethros fell nonetheless, because the binding laws were abandoned in favor of conventional warfare, because the royal houses chose conquest over cooperation, because they believed that power taken by force was more reliable than power shared through understanding. The parallels to his own kingdom's history were impossible to ignore. Kael had built his realm through exactly the kind of conquest that had destroyed Ethros, had used the binding laws not to create understanding but to ensure dominance, had transformed tools of cooperation into instruments of control. The binding between us, he said carefully, represents a return to the original purpose of these laws, whether by design or accident, Lyra agreed. We are bound not as master and servant, but as equals forced to understand each other's truths. Outside the library windows, the sun was setting over a kingdom that faced threats from multiple directions. Its survival depended on strategies born from the forced cooperation of ancient enemies. The binding that held them together was no longer simply a mystical constraint. It was a bridge between past and present, between conquest and understanding, between the kingdom that was and the kingdom that might yet be. The question that remained was whether that bridge would prove strong enough to bear the weight of history and hope both. The attack came at dawn, just as Lyra had predicted, but not in the manner anyone had anticipated. Kael stood in the war room as reports flooded in from scouts and messengers, each piece of information painting a picture that grew more disturbing with every revelation. The enemy forces had indeed moved to occupy Millhaven, had indeed positioned themselves to counter his expected assault on the town, but their true strategy went far beyond anything discussed in their planning sessions. Your Majesty, General Marcus reported, his weathered face grim with implications that extended beyond immediate military concerns. The enemy forces are not attempting to hold Millhaven. They are systematically destroying it. The words struck Kael like a physical blow. The evacuation had saved the civilian population, but the town itself, the buildings that represented generations of work and prosperity, the infrastructure that supported trade throughout the eastern territories, was being reduced to ash and rubble. They never intended to occupy the territory, Lyra realized, a voice carrying the hollow tone of someone whose worst fears were being confirmed. They meant to destroy it completely, to eliminate the economic foundation that supports this region. But why? Lord Aldrich demanded. Destroyed territory provides no strategic value, no resources, no tactical advantage, unless the destruction itself is the strategy, Kael replied, understanding beginning to dawn like a cold sunrise. They are not trying to conquer this kingdom. They are trying to make it ungovernable. The implications were staggering. A conventional conquest would at least preserve the infrastructure and population that made territory valuable. But systematic destruction would leave behind wastelands that could not support armies, refugees that would strain neighboring regions, and economic devastation that would take decades to repair. It is more than military strategy, Lyra said quietly, moving to the window that overlooked the courtyard where their own forces were preparing to march. It is revenge. Revenge for what? For what your family did to Ethros. The words hung in the air, like an accusation that could not be answered or dismissed. Kael had known that his ancestors had participated in the destruction of earlier kingdoms, had built their power on the ruins of previous civilizations. But he had never considered that such ancient grievances might still drive contemporary conflicts. Explain, he commanded, though part of him dreaded the explanation. Lyra turned from the window to face him directly, her expression carrying a weight of historical pain that went far beyond personal grievance. The kingdom of Aethros was not destroyed by a single conquest or a decisive battle. It was systematically dismantled over the course of decades, its cities burned, its population scattered, its very memory erased from the land. By whom? By an alliance of 7 kingdoms that decided Aethros had grown too powerful, too influential, too dangerous to be allowed to continue existing. Your ancestors led that alliance. The revelation struck him like lightning strikes a tree, sudden, illuminating, and permanently transformative. His family's rise to power had not been built on legitimate conquest or superior military skill, but on the coordinated destruction of a civilization that had posed no immediate threat to anyone. The 7 Kingdoms War, he said slowly, remembering. Fragments of history that had been taught to him as tales of heroic unity rather than genocidal conspiracy. Your tutors called it a war of liberation, Lyra replied bitterly. They said your ancestors freed the peoples of Aethros from tyrannical rule, brought order to chaos, established peace through strength. And the truth? The truth is that Aethros was peaceful, prosperous, and powerful enough to prevent the 7 kingdoms from expanding their territories through conquest. So they decided to eliminate it entirely, to divide its lands among themselves and erase its very existence from history. Master Aldwin stepped forward, his scholarly instincts compelling him to seek verification, even in the face of emotionally charged revelations. The historical records from that period are fragmentary and contradictory. How can you be certain of these claims? Lyra reached for the silver pendant at her throat, her fingers working at a clasp so small it was nearly invisible. The ancient metal opened like a flower, revealing an interior chamber that held not jewels or gold, but a piece of parchment folded so many times it seemed impossibly small. Because my family carried the treaty, she said, carefully unfolding the document with the reverence due to irreplaceable artifacts. The actual agreement between the 7 kingdoms, outlining their plans for the systematic destruction of Aethros. The parchment, when fully opened, revealed text in multiple hands and languages, signatures and seals that spoke to the formality and privatization of what had been planned. At the bottom, clearly visible despite the document's age, was a seal that Kael recognized with sickening certainty, the mark of House Drakemore, his own family's crest. This document has been in your family for how long? Master Aldwin asked, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 centuries, Lyra replied. Carried by refugees who escaped the final destruction of our capital, preserved by people who wanted future generations to know the truth about what had been done to them. Kael stared at the ancient treaty, reading words that condemned his ancestors as surely as if they had been written in blood. The agreement was comprehensive, detailing not just military strategy, but plans for cultural destruction, the burning of libraries, the scattering of populations, the systematic elimination of anyone who might carry knowledge of Aethros' laws, customs, or history. The binding laws, he realized. Your family preserved them because they were part of what the 7 kingdoms tried to destroy. Along with our language, our customs, our very identity, Lyra confirmed. Everything that made Aethros what it was, your ancestors sought to eliminate forever. But they failed, Lord Aldrich observed. You are here, carrying that knowledge, using those laws. We are the last, Lyra replied. My bloodline is the final remnant of Aethros royalty. When I die, the kingdom dies with me. The weight of this truth settled over the war room like morning fog over a graveyard. Here was the ultimate irony. The binding that held them together had been created by a civilization that his family had helped destroy, wielded by the last heir of that civilization against the descendant of its destroyers. The enemy forces, Kael said slowly, understanding beginning to crystallize into horrifying clarity. They are not acting independently. Someone has coordinated this attack, someone with knowledge of the true history. Someone who knows that destroying this kingdom will complete what the Seven Kingdoms began centuries ago. Lyra agreed. The final elimination of any trace that Ethros ever existed. But you are bound to me now. Your survival depends on mine. Your success requires the preservation of this kingdom. Lyra's smile held no warmth, only the bitter satisfaction of someone whose long-planned revenge had achieved unexpected complexity. Yes, the binding ensures that the last heir of Ethros can only survive by preserving the kingdom built on Ethroses. Runes. The irony is quite perfect. Before Kael could respond, another messenger burst into the war room, his face flushed with the urgency of dire news. Your Majesty, the enemy forces have changed their strategy again. They are no longer destroying Millhaven, they are fortifying it. What? They have begun construction of permanent defensive positions, as if they intend to hold the town indefinitely. Our scouts report that additional forces are approaching from the south and west, far more than originally estimated. The tactical situation had shifted again, but now Kael understood the broader strategy with terrible clarity. The enemy was not trying to conquer his kingdom or destroy it quickly. They were trying to create a permanent foothold that would allow them to systematically dismantle everything his family had built, just as his ancestors had dismantled Ethros. They mean to do to us what we did to them, he said quietly. Justice, Lyra replied, though her tone suggested she was no longer certain whether justice and revenge were the same thing. After 3 centuries, the wheel finally turns. And you? Kael asked, looking at the woman whose fate was now inextricably linked to his own. What do you want to see happen now? Lyra looked down at the ancient treaty, then at the silver pendant that had carried her family's secrets for 300 years. When she finally met his eyes, her expression carried a complexity of emotion that defied simple categorization. I want to survive, she said finally, and I want the binding that holds us together to mean something more than mutual destruction. Outside the war room, enemy forces were digging in for a long siege, preparing to execute a strategy of systematic destruction that would take years to complete. Inside the room, the last heir of a destroyed kingdom and the descendant of its destroyers faced the choice between perpetuating ancient hatreds or finding a way to break cycles that had already consumed too many generations. The binding that held them together would determine not just their personal fates, but the fate of history itself. The war council that convened in the wake of the devastating revelations bore little resemblance to the confident military planning sessions of days past. The great table that had once displayed maps marked with confident strategies now held documents that told a story of generational conflict, ancient grievances, and the systematic destruction of civilizations. The silver pendant lay open beside the ancient treaty, its contents having transformed understanding of their situation from a conventional military threat to something far more complex and dangerous. Kael stood at the head of the table, the iron crown upon his brow feeling heavier than it ever had. Each embedded stone, each trophy from a conquered realm, now seemed to whisper accusations rather than celebrate victories. The weight of 3 centuries of history pressed down upon him like physical armor, making every breath an effort, every decision a judgment upon not just his reign but his entire bloodline. The enemy strategy is now clear, General Marcus reported, though his weathered face showed the strain of adapting to circumstances beyond conventional military experience. They have established permanent fortifications at Millhaven and are systematically destroying the economic infrastructure of the entire eastern region. Supply routes have been cut, trade centers burned, and refugee populations are moving westward in numbers that threaten to overwhelm our ability to provide aid. It is the Ethros strategy in reverse, Lyra observed, her voice carrying the hollow tone of someone witnessing the repetition of historical trauma. Systematic dismantlement rather than direct conquest. designed to make the territory ungovernable, rather than simply changing its ruler. Lord Aldrich studied the updated maps with growing concern. If they continue at this pace, the economic foundation of the kingdom will collapse within months. We cannot sustain the military effort required to dislodge them while simultaneously managing the refugee crisis and maintaining defenses along our other borders. Precisely their intention, Kael replied grimly. They understand that destroying a kingdom is more effective than conquering it. A conquered territory can be retaken, but destroyed infrastructure takes generations to rebuild. The binding that connected him to Lyra allowed him to sense her emotional state with increasing clarity, and what he felt from her was not satisfaction. At seeing her ancestral enemies face the same fate her people had suffered, but a deep sadness that seemed to encompass not just current events, but the entire cycle of revenge and destruction that had defined the relationship between their families. For centuries, there is another consideration, Master Aldwin interjected quietly, looking up from the ancient texts he had been studying throughout the crisis. If the enemy forces succeed in their strategy, if this kingdom falls as Ethros fell, then the binding laws themselves will be lost forever. The knowledge that Lady Lyra carries will die with her, and the possibility of using these laws for their original purpose, creating understanding rather than dominance, will be eliminated permanently. The implication struck the assembled council with the force of revelation. They were not simply fighting for the survival of a kingdom, but for the preservation of wisdom that might prevent future repetitions of the same cycle of destruction. The original purpose of the binding laws, Kael said slowly, looking at Lyra with new understanding. To create cooperation between potential enemies, to force understanding where conflict might otherwise prevail. Your ancestors abandoned that purpose in favor of conquest, Lyra replied. But the binding between us has restored it, whether we intended such a result or not. Then perhaps the solution lies not in military victory, but in demonstrating that the original purpose can still be achieved. General Marcus looked skeptical. Your Majesty, with respect, the enemy forces are not interested in philosophical discussions about ancient laws. They are systematically destroying everything we have built, because they believe we are incapable of change, Lyra said, her voice carrying a note of possibility that had been absent from all their previous discussions. Because they see only the kingdom that was built on conquest and assume it can only be maintained through conquest. What are you suggesting? That we prove them wrong. The idea that emerged from their discussion was audacious beyond conventional military thinking, requiring not just tactical innovation, but a fundamental reimagining of how conflicts could be resolved. Rather than attempting to dislodge the enemy forces through superior strength, the traditional Drakemore approach that had defined 15 years of successful warfare, they would offer something unprecedented. Genuine negotiation based on acknowledgement of historical wrongs and commitment to different principles going forward. The risk is enormous, Lord Aldrich warned when the basic outline had been established. If they reject our offer of negotiation, we will have revealed our weaknesses and our desperation. They could use that knowledge to inflict even greater damage. If they accept, we will have created a precedent that undermines the very foundation of royal authority, General Marcus added. How can a king acknowledge that his power was built on illegitimate conquest without calling into question the legitimacy of his continued rule? Kael looked around the table at the faces of advisors who had served him faithfully through years of successful expansion and consolidation. These were men who had learned to trust his judgment, who had followed him through campaigns that had seemed impossible and emerged victorious. Now he was asking them to support a strategy that contradicted everything they had learned about power, authority, and the nature of kingship itself. The legitimacy of my rule has already been called into question, he said quietly. The binding to Lyra has forced me to confront truths about my family's history that I can no longer ignore. The question is not whether our power was built on questionable foundations, but whether we can transform it into something more worthy of the people we claim to serve. And if the attempt fails, General Marcus asked, then we face the same fate that Aethers faced. Lyra replied, before Kael could answer. Complete destruction, systematic elimination, and the loss of everything that made our civilization meaningful. But if it succeeds, Kael continued, we create the possibility of breaking cycles that have defined relationships between kingdoms for centuries. We demonstrate that the binding laws can serve their original purpose. That understanding can triumph over conquest. That cooperation can be stronger than dominance. The preparation for what they had come to call the Unity Gambit required careful coordination between military readiness and diplomatic innovation. Messages were sent to the enemy commanders under flags of truce, requesting formal negotiation based on mutual recognition of historical grievances and genuine commitment to finding solutions that would serve the interests of all parties involved. They will assume deception, General Marcus warned as the messages were prepared for delivery. No king in recorded history has voluntarily acknowledged the illegitimacy of his own conquests, which is precisely why the gesture might succeed. Lyra replied, because it is so unprecedented that they will be forced to consider the possibility that we are sincere. And if we are sincere, Lord Aldrich asked, if this negotiation leads to genuine changes in how this kingdom operates, and how power is exercised and authority maintained. Kael looked at the silver pendant that lay open on the war table, its ancient contents having revealed truths that could not be unlearned or ignored. The binding that connected him to Lyra had already transformed his understanding of leadership, had forced him to see the world through the eyes of those who had suffered from his family's actions. There could be no return to the certainty and isolation that had defined his reign. Then we discover what kind of kingdom we can build when it is founded on truth rather than conquest, he replied. We learn whether the binding laws can create the kind of understanding that prevents the destruction of civilizations. As night fell over Valdris Castle, preparations continued for a confrontation that will be fought not with swords and armies, but with words and wisdom, with acknowledgement of historical truth and commitment to principles that neither side had fully tested. The binding that held Kael and Lyra together had become something more than mystical compulsion. It had become a bridge between past and future, between the kingdom that was built on destruction and a kingdom that might yet be built on understanding. The enemy forces camped beyond the horizon would soon receive an offer unlike any in the recorded history of warfare. Whether they would accept or reject, it would determine not just the fate of two kingdoms, but the possibility of transforming conflict itself into something that served creation rather than destruction in the distance. The massive siege horn that had called armies to battle for 15 years stood silent, waiting to sound either the call to war or the invitation to peace. The response came at dawn, delivered by a herald whose armor bore the signs of hard travel and whose expression carried the weight of messages that would determine the fate of kingdoms. Kael received the delegation in the Great Hall, with Lyra at his side, and the full court assembled to witness whatever answer the enemy commanders had provided to their unprecedented offer of negotiation. The enemy herald was a woman of middle years, her bearing suggesting military experience and her eyes holding the careful neutrality of someone who had served as messenger between hostile forces many times before. She approached the throne with the measured steps of formal protocol, but her attention seemed equally divided between the king who sat in judgment and the woman who stood beside him. Your Majesty, she began, her voice carrying across the hall. With trained clarity, I bring word from the Alliance of Restoration, representing the unified forces currently occupying your eastern territories. The formal name struck Kael like a revelation. This was not a simple military campaign or opportunistic invasion. It was a coordinated effort by multiple kingdoms, united under a banner that explicitly referenced the restoration of something that had been lost. Alliance of Restoration. Lyra repeated quietly, her voice carrying a note of recognition that suggested deeper implications. They have taken the name of the organization that tried to preserve Ethos during its final years. The herald's eyes fixed on Lyra with sudden intensity. "You wear the pendant of House Volthorn," she observed, her formal composure cracking. "Slightly. We were told that bloodline had been extinguished." "Nearly," Lyra replied, her hand moving instinctively to cover the silver pendant. "But not entirely." "Then you understand why we have come." The exchange between the two women carried currents of meaning that went beyond their words, speaking to connections and histories that predated the current conflict. Kael felt through the surge of emotions that Lyra experienced: recognition, hope, fear, and something approaching relief at the discovery that she was not as alone as she had believed. "Deliver your message," Kael commanded, though his attention remained focused on the subtle interplay between herald and heir, the enemy. Herald straightened, returning to the formal protocols that govern such exchanges. "The Alliance of Restoration acknowledges receipt of your offer of negotiation. We are prepared to enter into formal discussions regarding the resolution of current hostilities, provided that certain conditions are met." "Name them. First, that." "The negotiations be conducted not between conqueror and conquered, but between equals seeking mutual understanding. Second, that any agreements reached be binding upon successors and inheritors, preventing future violations through changes in leadership. Third, that the negotiations include formal acknowledgement of historical grievances and commitment to making appropriate restitution." The conditions were more reasonable than Kael had dared hope, suggesting that the Alliance of Restoration was genuinely interested in resolution rather than simply seeking advantageous surrender terms. But they also carried implications that would fundamentally transform the nature of his authority and the structure of his kingdom. "The first condition requires that I acknowledge your forces as legitimate representatives rather than invaders," he observed. "The second requires that any agreements be inscribed into law rather than depending on royal discretion," Lord Aldrich added, his tone carrying concern about the constitutional implications. "And the third requires formal acknowledgement that this kingdom was built on illegitimate foundations," Kael finished grimly. The herald nodded. "The Alliance understands that these conditions represent significant departures from conventional diplomatic practice. However, they reflect the unique nature of this conflict and the historical grievances that have driven it." "What form would such negotiations take?" Lyra asked, stepping forward with the authority of someone whose bloodline gave her standing. "In discussions that transcended contemporary politics. The Alliance proposes the ancient form of binding negotiation, as practiced in Ethos before its destruction. Representatives from each party would undergo the binding process, ensuring that agreements reached reflect genuine understanding rather than strategic advantage." The proposal struck the assembled court like lightning. Binding negotiation was not simply diplomatic protocol. It was mystical compulsion that would force all participants to experience the emotional and psychological perspectives of their opponents. It would make deception impossible, compromise inevitable, and transform the entire process from adversarial contest to collaborative problem-solving. "How many representatives?" Kael asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. 7. From the Alliance, representing the 7 kingdoms that participated in the original destruction of Ethos. 1 from the current ruling house, representing continuity with that historical action. And the binding would be mutual, affecting all participants equally? "Yes, Your Majesty." Each representative would be bound to one counterpart, creating understanding that flows in both directions. Kael looked at Lyra, feeling through their own binding the complex mixture of emotions this proposal evoked in her. There was hope, the possibility that genuine resolution might be achieved. that cycles of revenge and destruction might finally be broken. But there was also fear. The binding would expose not just his thoughts and feelings to enemy representatives, but hers as well, revealing the full complexity of her relationship with the king she had come to kill. The risks, Lord Aldrich said quietly, voicing concerns that every member of the court was undoubtedly considering, are enormous. The binding would reveal our defensive capabilities, our strategic weaknesses, our internal divisions. It would also reveal theirs, Lyra pointed out. And more importantly, it would ensure that any agreements reached serve the genuine interests of all parties, rather than providing temporary advantage to one side or the other. Your Majesty, General Marcus stepped forward, his weathered face grave with military implications. We have perhaps 6 hours before the Alliance expects our response. After that, they resumed their systematic destruction of the Eastern Territories. The time pressure was deliberate, designed to prevent extended deliberation that might lead to refusal or attempts to find alternative solutions. But it was also reasonable. Negotiations of this magnitude could not be delayed indefinitely while populations suffered and infrastructure burned. If we accept, Kael said slowly, thinking through implications that extended far beyond immediate military concerns, we commit to a process that will fundamentally transform this kingdom. The binding negotiations will reveal truths that cannot be hidden, will force acknowledgments that cannot be retracted. If we refuse, Lyra replied, the Alliance continues its systematic destruction until nothing remains of the kingdom your ancestors built. The choice is between transformation and elimination. The herald waited with the patience of someone accustomed to giving rulers time to make decisions that would echo through history. Around the Great Hall, courtiers and advisors exchanged glances that spoke to the magnitude of the moment and the impossibility of predicting its consequences. The binding between Lady Lyra and myself, Kael said finally, would it be affected by additional binding connections? The existing binding would remain intact, the herald replied, but it would be supplemented by the negotiation bindings, creating a network of understanding that includes all participants. The image this created was both inspiring and terrifying. 8. People bound together by mystical compulsion that would force them to understand each other's perspectives completely, to feel each other's pain and hope and fear as if it were their own. It would be the most intimate form of diplomacy ever attempted, requiring a level of vulnerability that conventional negotiations were designed to avoid. I will provide our answer within the hour, Kael decided. Herald, you have our hospitality. Until that time. As the herald was escorted to guest quarters, the court erupted in whispered debates about risks and opportunities, about the wisdom of accepting conditions that would revolutionize the very nature of royal authority. But Kael's attention remained focused on Lyra, whose expression carried the weight of someone contemplating not just political transformation, but personal revelation on a scale that defied imagination. The binding that held them together had already changed both their lives beyond recognition. Now they faced the possibility of extending that transformation to include the representatives of 7 kingdoms, creating understanding that might heal wounds 3 centuries old or might simply ensure that everyone involved shared the pain of inevitable destruction. The choice between transformation and elimination was no choice at all, but accepting transformation meant embracing consequences that neither of them could fully foresee. The binding ceremony took place in the Great Hall at sunset, when the light streaming through the ancient windows cast everything in shades of golden shadow that seemed to bridge the gap between earthly politics and mystical transformation. 7 representatives of the Alliance of Restoration stood in a circle with Kael and Lyra, each pair positioned to face their designated counterpart in an arrangement that spoke to careful planning and profound understanding of the forces they were about to invoke. The Unity Blade lay on the central altar, a weapon so ancient that its origins had been lost to legend. its metal gleaming with an inner light that suggested purposes beyond mere warfare. According to the texts Master Alduin had discovered, the blade could only be wielded by those acting in perfect harmony, its power responding not to individual strength, but to unified intention that each representative of the Alliance carried their own history of loss and grievance. Lady Meredith spoke for the coastal kingdoms that had lost their trading ports to Drakemore expansion. Lord Garrett represented the mountain clans whose ancestral lands had been claimed through conquest. Captain Elena carried the voices of displaced populations who had become refugees in their own homelands. Each face told a story of suffering that could be traced directly to decisions made by Kael's predecessors, consequences that had rippled through generations to create the current crisis. "The binding we undertake is not punishment," spoke Master Thane, the eldest of the Alliance representatives, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had devoted his life to preserving the ancient wisdom. "It is illumination. Each pair will experience the world through their counterpart's perspective, will feel their pain and hope as if it were their own." Kael felt Lyra's hands slip into his as they approached the central altar. Their existing binding had prepared them for this moment in ways that the others could not fully understand. They had already experienced the transformation that came from being forced to see the world through enemy eyes, had already discovered that understanding did not necessarily create agreement, but it did create empathy. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly, though the question applied to more than the immediate ceremony. "I have been ready for 3 centuries," Lyra replied, her voice carrying the weight of ancestral preparation. "My bloodline has waited for this moment since the destruction of Aetheros." The ritual began with words in the old tongue, spoken in unison by all participants. The sounds filled the great hall with harmonies that seemed to resonate in the stones themselves, awakening echoes of power that had slept since the ancient kingdom fell. As the binding energy began to manifest, Kael felt the familiar sensation of his consciousness expanding to encompass Lyra's perspective. But now that expansion continued to include the other participants. Through Lord Garrett's eyes, he experienced the crushing weight of watching ancestral lands being divided among conquerors, of seeing sacred sites transformed into military outposts, of carrying the responsibility for preserving clan traditions when the physical foundations of those traditions had been destroyed. Through Captain Elena's connection, he felt the desperation of populations forced to choose between submission and starvation, the bitter irony of being ruled by the same forces that had eliminated their previous means of survival. Through Lady Meredith's binding, he understood the economic devastation that followed military conquest, the way that changing trade relationships could destroy communities that had prospered for generations, but the binding worked in both directions. Even as Kael experienced the pain his family's actions had caused, the Alliance representatives experienced the weight of leadership that had driven those actions. They felt the constant pressure of threats from neighboring kingdoms, the impossible choices between competing needs, the burden of making decisions that would affect thousands of lives regardless of which option was chosen. Lord Garrett gasped as he experienced the reality of coordinating defense against multiple simultaneous threats. Lady Meredith staggered under the weight of understanding how economic policies that seemed cruel from below appeared necessary from the perspective of maintaining kingdom-wide stability. "This is what your ancestors intended," Lyra said, her voice carrying across the hall to all participants. "Not domination, but understanding. Not submission, but cooperation born from genuine comprehension of each other's circumstances." The Unity Blade began to resonate with energy that responded to their growing synchronization. As understanding developed between the bound pairs, the ancient weapon's light grew stronger, casting patterns on the walls that seemed to tell stories of possibility rather than conflict. "The binding reveals truth," Master Thane observed. his voice heavy with emotion as he experienced decades of Drakemore rule from the perspective of those who had wielded power rather than suffered under it. But truth alone is not sufficient. We must choose what to do with understanding once we possess it. Captain Elena stepped forward, her military bearings somehow softened by the empathy that now flowed between all participants. The Alliance came, here seeking justice through destruction, believing that the only appropriate response to historical wrong was equivalent retaliation. And now? Kael asked, though he could feel through the multiple bindings that her perspective had shifted in ways that surprised even her. Now, I understand that destruction breeds only more destruction, that justice achieved through elimination serves no one's genuine interests. She looked around the circle of bound participants. The question is whether we can choose creation over destruction, whether we can build something better than what existed before. The unity blade pulsed with light that seemed to respond to their growing unity of purpose. As understanding crystallized into shared commitment, the ancient weapon rose from the altar without being touched, hovering in the center of their circle like a promise of what cooperation might achieve. "Then let us choose," Lyra said, her voice carrying the authority of ancient bloodlines and new possibilities alike. "Let us build something worthy of the binding that holds us together." 6 months after the binding ceremony, Valdre's castle had been transformed in ways that extended far beyond architectural changes. The great hall where Kael had once sat in solitary judgment now hosted regular councils that included representatives from all the territories within the expanded kingdom. The throne itself had been replaced by a circular table that accommodated the new reality of shared governance, with seats for the Alliance representatives, who had remained to help implement the agreements forged through mystical understanding. Lyra stood at the great window that overlooked the restored eastern territories, watching as the town of Millhaven rose from its ashes with improvements that reflected collaboration between the original inhabitants and the Alliance settlers who had chosen to remain. The reconstruction had become a symbol of what was possible when former enemies worked together rather than simply exchanging one form of dominance for another. "The binding has changed more than we anticipated," Kael observed, joining her at the window. The connection between them remained strong, but it had evolved from mystical compulsion to voluntary partnership, supported by understanding so deep that separation seemed not just impossible, but undesirable. "Change was always the intention," Lyra replied, though her tone suggested satisfaction with outcomes that had exceeded even her optimistic projections. The question was whether the change would be destructive or creative. The new kingdom they had built together incorporated elements of Aethero's law that Lyra's bloodline had preserved, combined with practical innovations that reflected the realities of governing diverse populations with different needs and traditions. The binding laws had been restored to their original purpose, creating networks of understanding between leaders rather than tools of domination. Regional governors were bound to representatives of the populations they served, ensuring that policy decisions reflected genuine comprehension of their consequences. "The other kingdoms are watching," Kael noted, referring to reports from ambassadors who had observed the transformation with mixtures of curiosity and concern. "Some see opportunity, others see threat. They see change, and change frightens those who benefit from current arrangements," Lyra replied. "But change also inspires those who suffer under those arrangements." Already, 3 neighboring kingdoms had requested assistance in implementing similar reforms. The binding negotiations had proved so effective at resolving conflicts that demand for such services was growing faster than trained facilitators could be prepared. Master Thane had established an academy for teaching the ancient arts, while Master Aldwin worked to recover and preserve additional texts that might contain lost wisdom about cooperation and understanding. "Lord Aldrich brings news from the northern borders," Kael said, indicating the advisor who approached with the measured step of someone carrying important but not urgent information. "Your Majesty, your Ladyship," Lord Aldrich began, his formal address reflecting the new reality of dual leadership that had emerged from their partnership. "The Kingdom of Kael has requested mediation for their succession dispute. Both claimants have agreed to binding arbitration rather than civil war." The request represented validation of the principles they had fought to establish, rather than allowing internal conflicts to escalate into the kind of destructive wars that had plagued the region for centuries. Kingdoms were beginning to seek solutions that preserved rather than destroyed. "Who would serve as mediators?" Lyra asked. "Lady Meredith and Captain Elena have volunteered, along with Master Thane, for ceremonial oversight. They believe their experience with the binding process qualifies them to facilitate similar negotiations." Kael nodded approvingly. The Alliance representatives had become partners rather than former enemies, their perspectives and expertise contributing to governance in ways that strengthened rather than weakened the kingdom's effectiveness. "What of the succession question?" "Here," Lord Aldrich continued delicately, "the Council has raised questions about formal arrangements for the future of the dual monarchy." The question had been inevitable. The binding between Kael and Lyra had created a form of shared rule that had no precedent in law or tradition, raising complex questions about inheritance, succession, and the institutional framework that would preserve their innovations beyond their own lifetimes. "The binding laws provide guidance," Lyra said thoughtfully. "Traditional monarchy depends on bloodline inheritance, but the binding creates relationships based on understanding and compatibility rather than genetics." "You propose succession through binding rather than birth?" Kael asked, though he could sense through their connection that she had been considering such possibilities for months. "I propose that future leaders be chosen through their ability to understand and serve their people, demonstrated through binding connections that ensure they cannot ignore the consequences of their decisions." The concept was revolutionary, transforming monarchy from inherited privilege to earned responsibility. Future rulers would need to demonstrate not just political skill or military capability, but genuine empathy and understanding for the populations they sought to govern. "The risks are considerable," Lord Aldrich observed. "Such a system would require institutional safeguards we have not yet developed." "All meaningful change requires risks," Kael replied. "The question is whether the risks of innovation are greater than the risks of stagnation." As evening approached, they gathered in the Great Hall for the daily council session that had replaced the formal court ceremonies of the old regime. Representatives from every region and population within the kingdom attended, their voices carrying equal weight in discussions that shape policy through consensus rather than decree. Lyra took her place at the circular table, the silver pendant at her throat catching candlelight in patterns that no longer seemed to whisper of lost kingdoms but of possibilities yet to be achieved. The binding that had begun as Kael's tool of dominance and her weapon of revenge had become something neither had anticipated, a bridge between past and future, between what was and what could be. "The restoration is complete," she said quietly, though her words carried across the hall to every listening ear. "Not the restoration of what was lost, but the creation of something better than what existed before." Kael reached for her hand across the table, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that symbolized not just personal partnership, but the principle that had transformed their kingdom. The binding that held them together had proved stronger than the hatred that had driven them apart, more enduring than the cycles of revenge that had defined their families' histories. Outside the great windows, the lights of a peaceful kingdom glittered like stars, each one representing lives that had been changed by the discovery that understanding could triumph over conquest, that cooperation could be stronger than dominance, that love, in all its forms, could indeed conquer even the deepest wounds. of history. The binding laws had been restored to their original purpose, but their true power lay not in mystical compulsion, but in the willing choice to see the world through another's eyes, to feel their pain as your own, and to build a future worthy of that shared understanding.